many books, including a just published major work with Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Dissent.
Consent.
Manufacturing Consent, excuse me. Terror Network, A Response to Claire Sterling, and many other books. And he's a director of our institute. Jane Hunter, on my left, is the editor of Israeli Foreign Affairs and the author of many books and articles about Israel's role not only in the Middle East but in Central America and in Southern Africa. I highly commend Israeli Foreign Affairs to you. The information for ordering it and subscribing to it are also available in the literature area. It's one of the best publications available in this country to find out information about the Middle East, which is very, very difficult to come by otherwise. And our third speaker is John Stockwell at the left of the table. John was a CIA case officer for some 13 years and spent much time in Congo, in Vietnam, and in Angola, where he was the chief for the CIA of the task force on Angola. He also, when he left the CIA, wrote a very important book called In Search of Enemies. And recently, John is one of the founders of an organization called the Association for Responsible Dissent, or ARDIS, made up of a group of experts in national security matters, former CIA officers, former FBI officers, and open, I believe, to members of the general public who are interested in supporting those work and those studies. We will now begin. I'll turn the floor over to Edward Herman.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you. Disinformation originally meant secretly planted false evidence designed to deceive some target audience. It's gradually been extended in meaning to include open as well as sub rosa deception, although some people continue to use the older meaning. One reason for moving to this broader concept of disinformation is that open deception is more important than the covert variety in both quantity and effect on the domestic market. And the home population is the primary target of disinformation campaigns. Disinformation would not be an important factor in the flow of domestic news if the mass media served their self-proclaimed role of watchdog, protecting the public from abuses by the powerful. Deliberate lies would be ferreted out quickly, corrections would be prominent, and the powerful would be shown that lying does not pay. But the real world is quite different. The mass media are part of the power structure, and their occasional vigorous efforts as watchdog usually occur when the elite itself is divided and engaging in some kinds of mutual recrimination, as in the famous Watergate case. When the elite is in agreement, the watchdogs are usually silent in the face of disinformation that advances consensus ends. Mass media leaders usually enthusiastically support national policy, which makes them very reluctant to challenge convenient lies and myths. The government has also mastered the art of news management, timing news releases near deadlines, surrounding them with hoopla, and stifling internal dissent in favor of a uniform line, thereby reducing journalists' ability to raise doubts about hot news. Furthermore, the government and its allies have stepped up their intimidating tactics on journalists and on media organizations, making challenges to government claims more costly. Most notable has been the development of flak machines, which are right-wing organizations that attack and threaten the media who depart from the party line. The result of all this is that when the government uses disinformation, the mass media very often pass it along without question, even if it's extremely implausible. They then fail to investigate aggressively to check out its truth or falsity. And when its disinforming character is finally disclosed, often by the dissident press or by parties unconnected with the media, the corrections are on the back pages and very low-keyed. The net result is that disinformation pays, even if it's quickly proven to be a lie. When the Reagan administration accused the Soviet Union of deliberately shooting down Korean airliner 007 in September 1983, the media jumped on the bandwagon with enthusiasm, on the government's say-so, and then they simply refused to investigate. When the government's claim was eventually shown to be a knowing lie, the new information was treated very matter-of-factly, without any reflections on the episode as a propaganda campaign based on disinformation and gullibility. The New York Times finally had an editorial on the subject which blamed the government, but didn't say anything about the New York Times' own responsibility. But the government lie would not have been effective without the New York Times gullibility and its lack of investigative zeal, and then a tiny and muted correction. An even more illuminating illustration of media collaboration and a disinformation operation occurred when the administration justified its bombing of Libya by the claim that Libya had been responsible for the bombing of a discotheque in West Germany. In an editorial at that time, on April 15, 1986, the Times said that this was a perfectly good thing to do because the government said it had irrefutable proof of Libyan involvement. The Times didn't insist on seeing this proof, although the government had claimed irrefutable proof of the Libyan hit squad of 1981, which did not exist. Subsequently, the Times reported new government suggestions that the Syrians were involved in the discotheque bombing. But the New York Times simply reported these new suggestions of Syrian involvement without saying, my goodness, maybe we better go back and look at the allegations that the Libyans were involved, or in reconciling the Syrian and Libyan involvement. So even at that point, the paper still failed to insist on evidence or attempt any kind of reconciliation of these conflicting claims. It is on the basis of patriotic gullibility like this that the systematic use of disinformation is built. Let me discuss very briefly 3 cases involving Central America. Disinformation is very important in supporting U.S. policy there because the gap between our nominal and real ends is enormous. The government therefore systematically engages in the practice of transference or projection, attributing to its victims something approximating its own actions and policies. One case was the administration's allegation that the Sandinistas openly proclaimed a, quote, revolution without frontiers, unquote. This was based on a speech by Tomas Borges in which he said that the idea, he said, of progressive change stimulated by the Nicaraguan experiment was effecting a revolution without frontiers. The administration used this to prove that the Sandinistas intend to invade its neighbors by using the phrase revolution without frontiers in isolation from the very clear statement of its true meaning. This piece of disinformation transferred to Nicaragua in intention what the United States and its surrogates were doing in reality in incessant cross-border attacks, which did constitute a genuine counter-revolution without frontiers. The media at first treated this point of administration disinformation, quote, objectively, passing it along as news. Eventually, it was reported in muted fashion that some questions had been raised about the authenticity of the Borges quote. No conclusions were drawn. There was, of course, no discussion of the Orwellian character of the administration claim in the first place. The disinformation served its purpose. The mythical claim was stated loudly and frequently, and it's still used. The admission of possible error was muted, and no retrospectives were offered. A more complex case of transference in disinformation is the U.S. sponsorship of elections in El Salvador as an expression of devotion to democracy. In fact, the purpose of the Salvadoran elections of 1982 and 1984 was to provide a democratic facade to induce Congress to provide money to continue a proxy war to defeat democratic forces and preserve elite and army rule. This required a literal structure of disinformation on U.S. purposes, on the role of the military, on the intended exclusion of the guerrillas and their supporters, and on the underlying conditions that bear on a free election. For example, the guerrillas and FDR had to be portrayed as opposing democracy in their refusal to participate in the election, and not as a, quote, main opposition, unquote, excluded by plan and by threat of death. In Nicaragua, the U.S. government agenda was reversed. The Contras were seeking democracy, and Arturo Cruz represented a main opposition by U.S. government fiat. In an amazing feat, the U.S. media, mass media, allowed this structure of disinformation on the Salvadoran and Nicaraguan elections to prevail. El Salvador is a fledgling democracy, whereas Nicaragua, which had a freer and fairer election and a government that does not murder civilians on a routine basis, has an unelected government. A final case that I think is quite illuminating involves the media coverage of the murder of Herbert Anaya in El Salvador. This is a fairly complex case that I discuss in detail in the forthcoming issue of Covert Action Information Bulletin. The essentials are this. Anaya was head of the human rights organization, the chief human rights organization in El Salvador, which had already suffered 8 murders at the hands of the army and paramilitary right. And Anaya was surely murdered by these same forces which had been harassing him and which had been apprehending, arresting his associates and engaging in surveillance over him, and he was attacking them. So there's no question, and there's no question by any people really in El Salvador, that he was murdered by the same forces that had murdered his 8 predecessors. But a few weeks after the murder, Duarte and company brought forth a young student named Miranda, who had been illegally held by the police for 12 days and eventually confessed to murdering Anaya under orders of the rebels. He was paraded before television and before the foreign journalists, but he was given $2,400 in cash and was soon released, having committed this murder. Immediately following his release, he declared that his confession was untrue and had been a result of torture. And as a matter of fact, there was a previous case exactly analogous to this in 1983 when another student named Alvarado had been arrested and had, under torture, confessed. And as soon as Alvarado was released, he said that he'd been tortured. And in fact, the FBI had examined the Alvarado case since the murder there involved an American. And therefore, the FBI came in and said that Alvarado couldn't have done it. But so it was a rerun of a pattern. And back with Alvarado, too, they'd put him before TV, and they'd had the journalists in to have him confess after incarceration. So we had a rerun. But James Lemoyne and the New York Times took the Miranda confession seriously, with 2 articles featuring the confession, framing it to put the blame on the rebels, stressing that the allegation was the rebels had done it, and giving it credibility, although very cautiously suggesting that the proof was not all in. The articles were a travesty of honest reporting. They had never mentioned the Alvarado case, and they never mentioned the threats to Anaya previously and the harassment of Anaya prior to his murder. And the thing was full of items that violated simple media objectivity. When Miranda confessed upon his release, the recantation was given by the New York Times on a very terse back-page article in an AP release. In short, this small disinformation program carried out by the Duarte government, while not effective in El Salvador at all, was almost surely successful in its impact on the audience of the New York Times because the New York Times played dumb and they allowed this point of disinformation to be given reasonable publicity. I think this is a very important case because you had something where they didn't literally lie. This was a form of disinformation in which actually the Duarte government lied, but the crucial thing here is to see how the New York Times played dumb. They stripped all the context out of the picture, and they themselves didn't lie. They just presented the material in such a way that more readers of the Times would think that this was true than would have seen that little recantation. And of course, no important thing is that there were no follow-ups and no discussions of what this all meant in the pattern of activity in El Salvador and the meaning of the Duarte government. So I would conclude by saying that open disinformation, which is now really the most important kind of disinformation, depends critically on the media playing dumb. This is a collective effort, disinformation. The government now knows that if it makes an implausible claim about Nicaragua or Libya, the mass media will take it at face value, even if it's implausible, even if the government had told a lie about the same subject or country a week before. So serial lying becomes possible because there's no correction and rectification and putting this all in a context of a serial pattern. The corrections and qualifications, if they come at all, will be on the back pages in low key. Disinformation works. The watchdog doesn't bark. It swallows toads and then it whimpers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. There's a very interesting point about the last item Ed mentioned in a new book by Mark Hertzgaard called On Bended Knee, the press on the Reagan administration, where he talks about what Ed just mentioned and calls it the attribution excuse, whereby the major media will say, we didn't say that Thomas Borge was a cocaine dealer. We said that President Reagan said that Thomas Borge was a cocaine dealer. And you'll see so many stories that begin, today the president said, dum-da-dum-da-dum-da-dum-da-dum, and never is another paragraph saying, however, all of us journalists looked at each other and said, that's a crock. That's never in there. They just say, today the president said. And that, in fact, one of the journalists who was interviewed said he thought the most important thing that should be taught in journalism schools or in high schools is the concept of attribution. That it's very important because the average reader doesn't quite understand who it is that's saying what. And that's precisely what Ed was talking about. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Jane Hunter.
Thank you very much. And I want to start by saying how tremendously honored I am to be part of what I hope is the first step forward of a much accelerated move by all of us in this new Bush era. Looking at the Middle East, which is a vast area, and what kind of stories come out of it would be an impossible task in the 15 minutes that I have to talk. And so instead what I'd like to do is to just highlight some of the more important myths, lies, and shibboleths that are prevalent in the media, particularly around Israel. Why focus on Israel as opposed to any of the Arab governments, and particularly some of the wealthier, more backward Arab governments? Well, very simply because this country is the prime economic and political backer of Israel. And so what Israel does is, in a sense, as important and as relevant to all of us here as what our own government does in terms of our being responsible for confronting, opposing, and trying to stop it. Perhaps the greatest lie, misunderstanding, misconception around the coverage of Israel, to be actively supported, not only just parroted, but actively supported by almost all of the mainstream media, is the notion of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And by Holocaust is commonly meant the killing of 6 million Jews by the Nazis during the late 30s and the 40s. There is absolutely no way here that I'm denying that that took place. Indeed, it did take place, and it was an extremely heinous crime. On the other hand, by the way that it is now passed down to the next generation, meaning my children when they were in school, and your children very shortly, our grandchildren, what we hear about is simply the killing of Jews because of anti-Semitism. This takes it out of the larger context of fascism, of the whole idea of an authoritarian corporatist state, of the whole idea of a regime that will differentiate, dehumanize, and then proceed on to genocide or to mass murder or to cultural obliteration or to political liquidation of another people, all of which are phenomena which have not only survived World War II, but have been actively supported in very many ways by our own government in its alliances and in its covert activities, but are also supported and perpetrated very directly by the government of Israel, which in its self-assigned role as the spokesperson for an expression of the Jewish people has inherited the mantle of victim of the Holocaust. What does this mantle mean? It means essentially that he who wears it is allowed to do anything. This finds expression within all segments of the Israeli body politic, most particularly on the right, as being the notion that nobody stepped forward to save the Jews in World War II. This is, of course, true for many of the same dynamics, or on account of many of the same dynamics that operate in our society today and allowed not only the Republican but the Democratic candidate to wage a racist campaign in the election that was just passed, that since nobody did come forward to stop Hitler, to support the Jews, to defend the Jews, the lesson to be drawn from that is that nobody will ever defend the Jews, and therefore the Jews must defend themselves, and that therefore, and when I'm saying the Jews, I'm saying this to paraphrase the Israeli position, and of course what they're meaning is not the Jews, but the government of Israel, and that therefore anything that the government of Israel does in its own self-defense, which is by its very nature a very preemptive affair, is completely justified. Thus, Israel having a nuclear arsenal is completely justified. Israel, which has probably launched more cross-border attacks in the past 10 years than any other country in the world, even this one, is yet the possessor of the world's sixth largest nuclear arsenal. It's therefore quite all right for Israel to arm the apartheid regime of South Africa and to share its nuclear weapons technology with South Africa, because in a pinch, if the United States decides to no longer support Israel, so the Israeli argument goes, or the justification for this goes, well, then the South Africans would be a good fallback position. And likewise, it's fine to send the graduates of the Israeli military system around the world to repressive countries to help on such things as the forced resettlement, so-called pacification program in Guatemala, and this after having helped with the genocidal attack of the government in the late 70s and early 80s against the indigenous Mayan people of that country, and into many other countries. It also justifies what one, if one reads the Israeli press, sees more and more over the past few years, which is this notion of Amalek, which is a tribe in the Bible which apparently transgressed so fearsomely that Amalek was slated for the full measure of retaliation, i.e. annihilation, i.e. genocide. It's used as a synonym, as a very well understood metaphor for the Palestinian people. These are all concepts, concepts which flow from the notion that the Holocaust was simply an attack on the Jews and that World War II had nothing to do with the rise of fascism. And this, of course, very ably allows one to look at World War II for children and even for the adult mass media consuming audience without and addressing the very interesting question of how did we emerge from having fought the Axis and then having built up and made alliances with these very countries and launched immediately into the Cold War. It lets us off the hook of having to look at the fascists in our own society and allows anti-communism instead to prevail. As far as from the Israeli point of view, this is very convenient because this also helps to buttress the next major concept to come out of the Middle East and make its way into our press and to help with the pretty much down the line blank-minded support that is extended to the State of Israel. And that's the notion of the land without people, for the people without land, which was perpetrated. Let me read you something that was published in something called the Palestine Post of 1938. And this is Congressman Hamilton Fish, at that point the first, who had supported the U.S. resolution in support of the Balfour Declaration, which was a British paper declaring the right of the Jewish people to a national homeland, and which was then mandatory Palestine. And Fish is saying this is when the British in 1938 had decided to reverse that and not to let Jews who were fleeing Europe, fleeing Hitler at the time, settle in Palestine. Fish, in a speech before Congress, emphasized that the Arabs had vast territories elsewhere than in Palestine. We now hear the same argument, which is put forth in the press in two ways. One way, that there are 22 other Arab countries, and why can't the Palestinians go and live in them? When the Palestinian people, of course, make the point that they have occupied the contended territory, Israel-Palestine, for more consecutive years than the present government of Israel, which was just declared in 1948. This, again, is going to be something that's going to be in the news in front of you because hopefully this weekend the Palestine National Congress in Algiers is going to declare a nation, a government of some sort or other. And this argument will be put forward. The other argument that's put forward is this whole idea of peace, and you notice that the word of peace is always used, Middle East peace process. We never hear the word justice, and the idea that peace can be achieved by somehow making a deal with King Hussein to take these people back under his rule, as they were under his rule until 1967. Then we also come to the notion, and this has been a very central notion in the past 8, almost 9 years now, of terrorism. And we're hearing that at this Palestine National Council meeting that Yasser Arafat is supposed to renounce terrorism. And this is just reported blankly, straight out by the press, without taking into account several things. One is Arafat, in something called the Cairo Declaration, Yasser Arafat, the chair of the PLO in 1985, underscored the determination of the Palestine Liberation Organization not to carry armed struggle outside of the contested territory, meaning Israel and the occupied West Bank and Gaza, and has held to this, although he did threaten after the assassination by Israel last April, which was carried out with, among other things, an airborne command and control center of the PLO's number 2 officer, Khalil al-Wazir, in Tunis, that Arafat said that perhaps he might reconsider it. It was also something that was brought up for reconsideration after Israeli frogmen from Mossad, Israel's secret service, bombed the ship of return earlier in the year. Although Arafat and the PLO have got to be portrayed as terrorists, because otherwise there would be almost no reason for Israel not to treat with them. The whole notion of Arafat as terrorist, not only before the U.S. public, but also before the Israeli public, was very well exemplified in the just concluded Israeli electoral campaign. The government allowed the Likud, which was the winning party, to put a very defamatory tape of Arafat on, did not allow the Progressive List for Peace, an Arab Jewish party, to put an interview with Arafat on in which he talks about the need to have an international conference and to recognize Israel. Likewise, the whole idea here that because Arafat is supposedly a terrorist, that the U.S. government might be able to bar him from coming at the end of this month to speak to the UN is going to be something that you're going to be seeing, and I hope everybody takes a couple of minutes to complain to his or her senator that this is not a very proper position to take as the host country to the UN. This would be, I would think, an urgent thing to do very soon. There are smaller canards that come out about Israel that also make it difficult for the U.S. public to oppose the prevailing bloc on any recognition and support of the PLO by this government. And one is the idea of enduring Arab hostility to Israel. Except for Syria, which hasn't even made many warlike moves, and there are indications of cooperation between Israel and Syria that have come on over the last few months. There are very few countries in the Middle East that wouldn't rather and have not signaled their intention to live at peace with Israel, which after all is one of the most powerfully armed countries in the world. Nonetheless, what is coming into our media now are stories about how Israel's enemies are preparing a nerve gas war against Israel. We saw this in the very big coverage in the press the last couple of months of how Iraq was using poison gas against the Kurds. This was something that is still subject to proof, although I personally don't doubt that gas has been used against the Kurds. I think the standard of proof was a lot lower than the standard of proof that has been required for such events as, say, the Israeli use of tear gas produced in the United States, shot into Palestinian dwellings, that has not only killed many people, but has also produced a great number of miscarriages. Interestingly enough, with all that we hear about the idea of a nerve gas attack on Israel by new generations of surface-to-surface missiles, an article in September in Defense and Foreign Affairs said Israel has the most sophisticated nerve gas program of all in the Middle East and has begun to work very intensively on it again. This was not even reported. And I would just like to close with going back to the more narrow definition of disinformation and talk about the story that was presented to us as a classic piece of Soviet disinformation, the idea that babies are being sold in Latin America and brought to the U.S. to have their organs removed to be used as donors for white U.S. babies. Well, I happened to run into that story. One of the issues I've been covering in my newsletter has been the Israeli purchase of babies for adoption in Latin America. One reason I cover it is because it's the population, the demographic issue in Israel and the occupied territories is a very important issue that the Israelis are trying to multiply, and they can't get many Jews to go settle in Israel from Western countries. So anything that brings large numbers of people in is a trend to watch. I watched this trend. I happened to get a clipping from the Guatemalan press very early in the year, which talked about Israeli couples buying babies that were perhaps either bought by middlemen or taken from mothers that didn't watch them. Remember, there were stories about babies being stolen in El Salvador and so forth and so on. Well, all this comes out, and at the end of this very, I would say, extremely anti-Semitic and ignorant Guatemalan article, there is a story essentially saying, and we have heard that perhaps these babies are taken and used for their organ parts rather than even adopted. Now, it made its way around as there was baby stealing in Brazil and Paraguay and so forth and so on. This story made its way around. I saw it next in the Jerusalem Post, is picked up by Reuters and essentially aimed at the fact that it was being done by people in the U.S. So I just think these things are interesting. They need watching. They need your skepticism. But more than that, they happen in a vacuum, and I think that to a large extent, we have been responsible for that vacuum by not vigorously challenging all of these canards, which once they come under close inspection, it's very easy to prove that they just don't fly at all. And thank you very much.
I come here to this panel with great excitement because it's so important, the subject of disinformation and manipulation of the media. And Bill asked me to focus on Africa, and there's a logic in that because I've lived 15 years in Africa as a child, but also 6 years as a CIA operative, and then in the Angolan operation, although I was in Washington on the National Security Council subcommittee supervising the Angola secret war. We were running an operation in Angola, and I went in to check on things. I would like to clear the record and take one of my 15 minutes or two and point out that my first book, In Search of Enemies, about the Angolan operation, I wrote it and brought it out 10 years ago, and there may be some real continuing Africanists in this audience. And while I try to keep up, I've actually, if you'll permit me, I've grown in other directions since that time. I've been, for example, the current covert operation of most interest was in Nicaragua, Central America of greater interest, or a better vehicle, if you will, to communicate to the people of the United States about how these things are run, because they can understand and identify with Nicaragua better than they can with Angola. So beginning in '81, I began to travel to Central America. I've given over 400 lectures using Nicaragua as a case study of covert action instead of Angola. And then my thesis, my readings went on beyond the secret wars of the CIA to try to show how CIA activities reinforce or even provide the rationales for things like the nuclear arms race. The works that I currently, 3 works that I currently have in progress, for example, include a handbook, a booklet called Racing On, the new handbook of the continuing nuclear arms race. And then a book that excites me enormously. I don't know if I'll be able to bring it off. It's the most complicated book I'll ever try to write. Co-authoring it with my wife, who is Vietnamese, and she's trying to capture the theme of a woman's anger at having to make her life in the shadow of men's wars, as women have had to do since the beginning of history. And my side of this story, I'm trying to capture the theme of what makes people like me, like Bud McFarlane, who was in my Marine Corps Basic School class, tick, and then what happened to make me change, whereas people like him, in fact, did not change. Now, directly to this panel, this subject, this wonderful conference, I think what I can bring most effectively to you is not to try to analyze current events in Africa, or current hot disinformation stories, which we have by the stacks, that are being put out about Chester Crocker magnificently organizing, the salvation of Angola and a peace accord and everything immediately before the elections, by the way, with the South Africans doing some bowing and nodding to help make it look like it's going to happen, stuff like that, which, I could show you clippings, but I really think, if you'll permit me, that it would be more useful if I got into the mechanics of how people inside the government, inside the CIA, mechanically work to get their propaganda themes into the media. Mind you, my life totally unplanned, but it led me through a series of circumstances where I was on the scene and then read the New York Times, what they had to report about what was going on. There are things like being up country in Vietnam with the only road that led to my post, being cut regularly by VC forces in this little village called Hoc Mong, where they would come up out of tunnels in the ground and chop the road and then disappear when they were counterattacked. And the world press reported one of these counterattacks about the South Vietnamese tanks going in to liberate this little village in swirling clouds of dust. And you see, the trouble is the roads were paved. Moreover, it was the rainy season, and there was no dust. And then I came out of Vietnam in the evacuation of April of '75 on a flight with all the other refugees and spent some days in the tents in this little city they set up on Clark Air Force Base in Manila. And the world press reported that we were living in, in seas of mud. And it didn't rain one time during those days, we were there. In Lubumbashi in 1967, CI mercenaries mutinying. Jean Schramm had taken Bukavu, and Bob Denard invaded from Angola in a magnificent, brilliant bluff, terrorized the United States, made us think, that the Katanga was about to be chopped off. There was hysteria everywhere until we found out there were only 16 of them, and they fled immediately. Someone, counterattacked. Well, a carload of journalists, big-name people from the big news services, showed up driving up from Lusaka in Zambia across the border into Lubumbashi, and they went directly to the American consulate and to get briefed on, what's happening really and where to go to look. And I was the briefing officer with the consul there, so I knew exactly. And then they got in their car. We told them it was over, that there were only 16 mercenaries and they'd fled the country. And so the journalists piled in their cars and drove back across the border, and then they filed their stories. And I got to read what they wrote based on our conversation, which was unidentifiable with anything that I had, in fact said. But the most interesting experience, those are just coincidentals, and the sloppiness of the thing, if you will, or the irresponsibility to truth and fact and detail in the major media's reporting. In the Angolan operation, though, I had this job on a subcommittee of the National Security Council, very much like the job in which Oliver North got himself and his president and his country into so much trouble. In this job, we did it by the book. We didn't have an off-the-shelf and that kind of madness. We did have one operative who definitely had sticky fingers in Kinshasa, but we didn't have deliberate diversion of funds to someone like Richard Secord. But we had 1/3 of my staff was professional propagandists whose job was to try to devise stories that would be plausible and yet would work to advance our media objectives. Our two major media objectives were to focus, one, the obvious one, to focus the blames on the Cubans and Soviets for what was happening in Angola, when in fact the simple chronology of events is they were responding to every one of our initiatives. We would go in with the stage of escalation and they would try to match it. We would go in with another step of escalation and again they would try to match it, until eventually, because we were lying to the public, to the world, to the press, to the Congress, and they were telling the truth about what they were doing. They were able to go in overtly with 40,000 troops and blow my 24 advisors and Jonas Savimbi's forces and this little South African force and mercenary force we'd assembled aside and wipe us out and stop the thing from that end of the line. The second objective, of course, of our media objective was to cover up our illegal activity. We had U.S. advisors inside the country, and that was illegal, and we were lying to the Congress about it. And so we had to cover that up to shield them from journalists' inquiries and exposure. We were dealing arms to South Africa, which was illegal, and of course we were very nervous about that being brought out, for example. We were delivering arms into Angola in large quantities, and once again we had to work very hard to cover that up so it wouldn't come out, to establish paper trails so journalists would get lost trying to track the arms that we actually were sending into Angola from the United States. Now, some of the problems we got into, mind you, I was in a mental state to quit the CIA, but I wanted to see this operation through to the end. By that time, mentally, I did not believe in what we were doing. I was taking notes. I had not thought about writing a book at the time, but I definitely expected there would be a congressional investigation, and I was taking elaborate, detailed notes, quotations, exact verbatim what people were saying. And I was protesting on occasion because my moral being was being resuscitated at the time by my reaction to the cynicism of what I'd seen in Vietnam and in this operation. And so, for example, I protested to my bosses about our involvement with South Africa and Angola. We brought in South African troops to do our fighting for us. And my boss, especially this Jim Potts, who was the chief of Africa Division, he couldn't understand what my argument was, because the best fighting troops in Africa south of the Sahara are probably the white South African troops. So to him, it was a very practical solution to bring these troops in. And I was trying to explain to him how much the white South African apartheid were hated. And finally, you could see the light bulb, bing, go off. So he put out actually a cable to all the field stations, including the ones like in London, for example, and Lusaka and Kinshasa, and New York, where we had a base at the United Nations, advising people to watch out as we framed stories and made statements and influenced people to speak out, to be very careful, because, as he put it, blacks tend to be irrational on the subject of South Africa. We had another little spin curve on this thing I ran into. I was protesting our use of mercenaries. Now, we had recruited 4 little mercenary army units and put them into Angola, hiring whites to send them into a black African country to kill blacks as a technique of imposing our policies on that country. And since I had grown up in the Congo, where Mike Hoare's the South African mercenaries had torn the country apart working for the CIA, I had a sense of the horror of what these people are. Moreover, they're terrible soldiers. And I was trying to protest and convey to Mr. Potts the pejorative sense that the word mercenary connotes, to the world at large. And he finally, once again, the light bulb went off, so he put out another cable to all stations involved saying, because of the pejorative connotation of the word mercenary, these people will hereafter be called foreign military technicians. And so then when we were testifying to the Congress and they asked if we had anything to do with these mercenaries that were showing up in Angola straight-faced, Mr. Potts and Bill Colby, the CIA director, said no. And nobody asked us if we had foreign military technicians in Angola. So, that was able to cover up the lies. How do you get stories into the major media if you're sitting in the CIA? Now, you have a cooperative press at some levels, but not always cooperative. And there's a lot of tension and argument and contradictions. Gulf Oil certainly has some influence in U.S. society, and Boeing, and they did not like what we were doing. And so you're, in a sense, in the CIA of being more defensive than you people in this audience would realize. And you have to find ways to get stories in, that will work, that the media will buy, that they won't turn them on you and blow you out of the water instead. Sometimes it's not a hard sell. We had one journalist, we flew over from Paris, who was working for us, traveling Africa for us, and he brought a hot story that made Holden Roberto look like a good guy, really magnificent, charismatic leader. The trouble is this story was written in French, and no one at the Washington Post could, translate it. And so my deputy went down and got the story and sat up all night with the translator putting it into good English, and then in the morning we gave it to the journalist who took it back to the Washington Post, which paid him $2,600 for it. Another example of how we got these stories out, getting into really a more elaborate structure, but it's no problem recruiting a journalist. I'm sorry, some of them high integrity, but some of them you just go with a fistful of money and they'll be quite happy, to help you with their stories, or sometimes without money, just to do their patriotic duty. The problem is, how do you cover them to their bosses and their colleagues so they will have an explanation of how they're getting these miraculously getting these stories out of the central part of Angola. You've got a journalist in Paris. How does he tell his boss he got this story about a big battle down in Angola? And so we set up a structure whereby it worked because of the blessings of President Mobutu and President Kaunda, who told the editors of the newspapers in their capitals to cooperate with UNITA force and the FNLA force, just for starters. Then I put writers, covert action we call them, which inside the CI is what you use to talk about propaganda, but covert action branch writers in Kinshasa and in Lusaka, and they would take vaguely accurate facts, geographically accurate or otherwise facts about the area, and then weave stories, and then they would give them to the FNLA and the UNITA reps to print in the local paper. Then we hired stringers in each of these capitals who would telex the stories up to our paid agent on major news services in the European capitals, and these people could then say, my stringer down in Lusaka just sent this hot story, and the story would come out, Dateline Lusaka, for example, or Dateline Kinshasa. Now, we still got into trouble on occasion and then had great triumphs on occasion. The trouble is we had an over-eager chief of station in Lusaka who came up with what he thought was a brilliant story. He had the UNITA forces capturing the city of Malanje and capturing 40 Soviet advisors. And see, what was brilliant about that, that would show that the Soviets were really behind this whole thing. Well, he didn't estimate the interest the world press would have in having 40 Soviets captured by a black liberation movement inside, the jungles of Angola, if you will. And so suddenly these chartered plane loads of journalists started descending on Silva Porto inside Angola and chasing down Savimbi, who hadn't been privy to what we were doing. And at that time, we hadn't taught him how to lie. The CIA had since taught him how to lie very effectively. And his answer to the journalists was, I don't know what you're talking about. My forces are bogged down 70 miles away from Malanje. I don't think we'll be able to capture it, and I don't think there are any Soviets in this country. Now, you see, the problem with that is that it makes your paid agent up there in Europe, who planted this story in the wire services, sweat blood, because he or she has to, get called in by the boss saying, where did you get this story, and what's the source of it? So this guy in Lusaka came up with an alternative story which had Cuban soldiers raping Angolan women. Now, see, this was a safe sell because no editor in the Western world is going to challenge it. The dirty commies raping African women, God, I'll run that, no questions asked. So he kept it going for weeks. He had a battle was fought, he set up the battle, and then he had it reported, and then the Cuban troops were captured, and then they were identified by the victims, and then they were put on trial, and then eventually they were executed by the women who allegedly had been raped. And we actually got into the world media photographs of young African women, girls if you will, 15-year-olds, who were holding these M16s and supposedly shooting down these Cuban rapists. Now, the Africans in that part of the world, I had grown up very nearby, they don't like to kill people, in truth, because the ghosts will hang around and haunt you. So to get someone to serve on a firing squad isn't easy, and especially the women, don't like the violence and would not serve on a fire. I mean, there was nothing authentic about this. There had been no rape whatsoever. In fact, our intelligence showed that the Cubans had conducted themselves with extraordinary sense of sensitivity to the needs of the Angolan people, and even Jonas Savimbi admitted that at the time. But, and this is an interesting point that I think has not come out in this conference yet, at least I haven't heard it, the truth still eventually came out. Now, this is what Carl Thayer was getting into last night, except he had it exactly backwards. He said, if we did such a bad job, why were the people still opposed to the Contra program? Well, we were opposed to it because we saw through the lies, because so many people went to Nicaragua and saw the truth. And eventually, everybody working so hard through the alternative press, we prevailed over the New York Times and managed to communicate to 70% of the people in this country that what was happening in Nicaragua was wrong. In the Angolan thing, despite our manipulations and an essentially sympathetic press, in July of '75, Tanzania was completely supportive of our side to the point of offering training camps for the FNLA forces. And Kenyatta made speeches supporting our line, and Idi Amin, who was the head of the OAU, made speeches supporting our line at that time. But by January of '76, 6 months later, 43 of the 45 states of the OAU voted overwhelmingly to condemn our program, because the truth had come out that South Africa was involved and that the CIA was involved and that the CIA was funding the mercenaries who were killing people inside Angola. So the truth eventually prevailed, and the program was in fact eventually shut down. I like to close on that because sometimes we get so frustrated when we see a George Bush Teflonized and slipped into office when he's a practicing criminal that we get discouraged. But we can win victories in this world despite the way the media is stacked against us. And so keep up the good work, and as I'll try to do.
Before we take questions, I just want to ask the other panelists if there are some remarks they want to say. Professor Herman wanted to comment about something I said earlier.
Yeah, is this thing working now? No, good. Well, Bill remarked, quoting Hertzgaard, he made the point that the press defend themselves by saying they must report what the president says. And he then said, but the press does not go on to say that we reporters think this is a lot of hokum. But actually, the press, when it does report what the president says and tries to justify reporting the president's remarks all by themselves, are really violating their own fundamental principles. The concept of objectivity and fairness says that if there is a potentially contestable claim, and especially if they have any suspicions that this has a manipulative intent, they're supposed to, quote, get the other side. They're supposed to seek out experts and get expert testimonies, and that should be that form of balance should be given immediately. And as I stress too, if there's any question about the integrity of the news, they should be investigatively very zealous in pointing these things up and coming back fast. So their rationale that they just must report what Reagan says violates their own principles. You should not let that escape. They are supposed to present balanced views, and when there's questionable material, they're supposed to be seeking out the truth and looking for experts and not just other officials and establishment experts. So they're systematically violating their own principles of fairness and objectivity when they take a Reagan proposition on Libya, present it, and don't do anything about it.
Thank you.